Thank you very much. Good to see all of you today. Thanks for another wonderful convention. The subject before us is homosexuality. We're going to look at the history of it, and we can talk a little bit near the end if you want. I think the write-up said we're going to look a little bit at how to address it, how to talk about it. We can get into that just a little bit at the end. If the videos work, I'm going to be pressed for 50 minutes as it is. So if you have questions along the way, please do ask at the time. Don't wait till the end. And I guess even more than that, a lot of this is going to be historical today, at least maybe half to three-quarters of it. I think it's a very interesting story how we got to where we are today. But I didn't live through a lot of this. I've talked to people who have. I've read a ton on this stuff. So if any of you have anecdotes, or if you remember reading stuff, or what happened during those times and first-hand experience, please do jump in. On the screen here, somebody, yeah, I think, which one, just the right? The New Normal, TV show out about that right now. Has anyone seen it? I'm struck by the audacity of that television station, whatever show that is, to actually put that on for their show. The New Normal, as opposed to what? The Old Normal? Is the Old Normal not good enough anymore today? And of course, in their advertisements, which I have to either quick flip the channel or get my girls out of the room, which are 3 years old on Monday, and then 4 months old, I don't want them seeing the homosexual couple that's advertised in this commercial. It's everywhere. And if the stats are right that homosexuality is only 3 to 4% of America, homosexuality is everywhere, especially on TV. This is the new normal. I've spoken with you. If you want to know a little bit about my family, I have a relative that is homosexual. I don't know him very well, but this is everywhere. And a lot of us know somebody firsthand or a family that is affected by this. How did we get here? How did this become so prevalent? A little bit of history. 1941 to 1945. What was it? World War I? Is that what I heard? World War II. World War II. Not 1914 to 1918. 1941 to 1945 was World War II. And what happened after World War II, for whatever reason, were a number of soldiers who came back from World War II that were dishonorably discharged from the United States military. Back then, when people are so conservative, where do you go if you're dishonorably discharged from the military? Anybody?
Hang around with the ones that were not dishonorably discharged with you, I suppose.
Yes, and where are you going to be dishonorably discharged? You are going to be placed in coastal cities. You're not going to go back home to the farm where everybody knows you. And so a growing trend happened in the late 40s. New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco. These people, dishonorably discharged, who had no place to go, went to these cities, and there became small pockets of these people. And they tried to blend in as best as they could. You have something called the Mattachine Society behind me with Harry Hay. We tried to make this as big as we could. The Mattachine Society, Harry Hay is basically a founder of all of this. It was his brainchild. He's a guy on the West Coast, and he wants to start something. He begins it by calling it, on the back it says Bachelors Anonymous. He wanted it to be just like Alcoholics Anonymous, where you would start with getting these small groups of homosexual-minded men together, and you could talk about it, and you could encourage each other with it, because back then, if that's the lifestyle you had, you're going to need some encouragement, because it was difficult. Not that I'm trying to elicit sympathy for the lifestyle, but you can understand the way they're thinking. Okay, he had other names for it called Society of Fools, but they ended up settling on the name Mattachine Society. Does anybody know what that means? Well, neither did I. And it's purposefully that way. What do you think when you hear the name Mattachine Society? Well, maybe machine. That's not the way I'm going. you start wondering, well, what is this? What does it mean? It's supposed to be a little bit enigmatic, a little bit of a puzzle, so that people would ask questions about it. Okay? What does it mean? Well, it comes from a name of French secret societies who were able to criticize the ruling elites. What does that mean? One, I'm reading what's printed behind you. It says one group, it's a mass group, was known as a Société Médecine. I'm not reading that the way French people would, but these societies, lifelong secret fraternities of unmarried townsmen who never performed in public unmasked, were dedicated to going out into the countryside and conducting dances and rituals during the Feast of Fools. Now you see why he wanted to be called the Society of Fools. This is where that came from too. At the vernal equinox. Sometimes these dance rituals or masks were peasant protests against oppression. Kind of see what their political philosophy is going to be coming out of this. With the maskers in the people's name receiving the brunt of a given lord's vicious retaliation. So we took the name Mattachine because we felt that we 1950s gays were also a masked group, unknown and anonymous, who might become engaged in morale building and helping ourselves and others through struggle to move toward total redress and change. What you know so far, what I brought to you, what is their philosophy? What do they want in calling themselves the Mattachine Society? What are they trying to address? Which establishment? They want to change the government and the structure of the United States so that homosexuality is acceptable. They did not like the way things were back then. Okay? And if you're in that group, you can't really blame them. That's what they're going for. So, between 1950 and 1968-69, these groups, the Mattachine Society and others like them, there's a female side of it called the Biltis group too, Women of Biltis, something like that, which is a lesbian group. They are growing slowly and slowly more in numbers. But they're a peaceful group. They want to fit into society. They do not want to be upfront, in your face, and aggressive. They want to fit in. They want to show you that they're good neighbors, that they're people to be taken seriously. And so they had magazines, they had publications that slowly grew in circulation. All that is about to change. And we get to something called the Stonewall Inn. This is a photograph that was taken this is in New York. In the late 60s, there's an inn and a bar in Greenwich Village, New York. It's an area. Greenwich is more the area. Stonewall Inn is a specific location. Back in the days, the cops knew the routine. They knew their gig, and they would go on their routine. They knew the homosexual places, the lesbian places, the bootlegging places, going way back. And they would make their rounds. And they would go in, they would bust the place up, they would beat some of the people up, and try to knock some sense into them. It was wrong, but this is just what happened. And the homosexual crowd took it. Okay? Then in 1969, you get a major event. The cops did their normal beat, their normal routine. They come into the Stonewall Inn in New York, and of course, the cops know what's going on in there, and they break it up, and they make some arrests. There's a problem this time, though. As they make their arrest and they're slowly leading people out, the police wagons are late in arriving. The wagons where they would put all these people on. So the cops are waiting. They've got people inside that are getting a little bit annoyed, and they have a growing crowd outside of like-minded people from the homosexuals on the inside of that place, and the crowd grows and grows and grows, and they start to become a little bit antagonistic. And some words are exchanged, and all of a sudden it's fighting for 3 days. The people lock themselves in, and it gets on lockdown, and it becomes an all-out fight. And I think at one time they took over about 6 to 8 city blocks. It was huge. Okay? And finally, of course, things settle down, the arrests are made, and life is supposed to go back to normal, right? starts to get out about what happened here. Even more than that, there was a code up until that time that you did not go against the police. The police were the law, you respected them, and you just took it, whether the police were right or wrong. From this point on, from the Stonewall Inn, what would change in the mentality of the homosexual crowd? Yes. Now we are going to get up front, we are going to get in their face. And actually, I should say, some of the crowds, people who heard about what happened at the Stonewall Inn, were sympathetic to what happened because there was police brutality. They were sympathetic to the people. From that point on, the whole Mattachine society changes. There's an influence that comes out of the Stonewall Inn that says we are no longer going to be tolerant of our tolerant leaders and the homosexual agenda. We need people who are going to be aggressive, upfront, who are going to fight about this stuff because that's the only way we're going to get real change. So that's the tipping point. The Stonewall Inn. And I have something here. This is a part of the article that was written. The ferries were not supposed to riot. No group had ever forced cops to retreat before. So the anger was just enormous. I mean, they wanted to kill. With larger numbers, police detained anyone they could and put them in patrol wagons to go to jail. Though Inspector Pine recalled, fights erupted with the transvestites who wouldn't go into the patrol wagon. His recollection was corroborated by another witness across the street who said, all I could see about who was fighting was that it was transvestites and they were fighting furiously. Okay. First-hand account. Here is another part. Kay Lloyd Lahuizen, who photographed the marches in 1965, stated, up to 1969, this movement was generally called the homosexual or homophile movement. Many newer activists consider the Stonewall Uprising the birth of the gay liberation movement. Certainly, it was the birth of gay pride on a massive scale. As many of you lived through and I didn't, being born in 1977, what else happened in the late 60s? Sexual revolution. This is fitting right in. The gay movement was not alone. They're not fighting this battle of becoming the new normal alone. They're grouping together with a lot of these other groups behind the scenes too. Hippies. Civil rights. Vietnam.
The Vietnam War.
Yeah. To be fair, is there a little point that they have? Should the police have been doing what they were doing?
They were wrong.
Well, of course not. But is the other side right? Of course not either. And so you see a mix of everything. And you could say that, you could probably say some of these tenets for those other groups during the time as well. Could the wars have been managed better? Sure. Possibly. But are you right to revolt against the government? Of course not. Rebel? No. So, what aspects so far have we been talking about? What has the homosexual crowd been going after so far with the Mattachine Society name? What do they want? What kind of acceptance? Societal and political. Keep that in mind. Who's on the screen behind me? Troy Perry, Baptist minister, grew up in Florida until about the age of, well, he ran away, but at the age of 15, he was a ordained Baptist minister. He was abused by his stepfather, and that's when he ran away, and he only returned home once his stepfather was out of the family, and his mom got rid of his stepdad. Okay, you'll notice that later on in the presentation, if God willing we have time to get there, one of the traits of people growing up homosexual is abuse when they're a kid. Troy Perry had that. Abused as a kid, and he's got bootlegger roots, which I didn't say. Some of the homosexual movement comes out of that too, because they're fighting the law. They're going against it, trying to conceal their actions and activities. Okay, so Troy Perry, abused by his stepfather, licensed Baptist preacher by the age of 15. If I remember right, he was married, broke up his marriage. Wife found a manual that he had written, or reported it was a homosexual manual. She talked to him, found out he was homosexual. They get a divorce. And he moves out to Los Angeles and starts his some kind of metropolitan church. And it's a big church all across the United States, even in Canada. He retired in 2005. I have a soundbite from one of his sermons that I'm not going to play because of time. The essence of his message, it's not that it's not vaguely or generically Christian. He has all the right sounding words. But love to him is more of an emotion. It's more of you just accept everybody. And so it doesn't have the teeth of what God actually says. The kind of love God has for his people is a disciplined love, okay, that's in the cross. And obviously God points out sin and then gives us the gospel. Troy Perry would not have too much to say about sin in a generic way. Where's the homosexual crowd going after with this one? Religious acceptance. And this is huge because he goes out there in the 70s and starts his homosexual church. And it grows very quickly with the roots that were already set down in the late 40s and early 50s on the West Coast. So you have political acceptance that they're going after. Now with Troy Perry, they're getting religious acceptance. Two huge fronts. I've read books that say and heard presentations the homosexual agenda would not be as far along if they had not infiltrated the church. That's exactly what they had to go after if they were going to be at the point they wanted to be. We're going to take a little different turn here. The American Psychiatric Association deals with mental disorders. One of the books they publish is called the DSM. And again, it classifies mental disorders. Where this book came from, actually, is again World War II. Europe put one out. They started recognizing some of the mental disorders that the soldiers had after the war. And then in the late 40s, I believe they asked the United States to go in together with them. And they did one together. And then in the early 50s, I believe, the United States Psychiatric Association broke away from Europe and started doing its own thing, calling it the DSM. This is important, okay, for what is classified as a mental disorder in the United States, and then what counseling is going to be like in the United States. Sorry it's so small. 1950 is the DSM-1, if you can see the very top line. In that manual that they put out, the very first one, it calls homosexuality a sociopathic personality disturbance. Has to do with the mind again, soul, personality. And so this was completely unacceptable for somebody to be a homosexual. That didn't last long, though. 1968 comes out the second one. They called it in there a pathological hidden fear of the opposite sex that was caused by traumatic parent-child relationships. You know, that's probably one of the best definitions they ever had. That's very, very accurate. And there's more to it than that, but that's very accurate. But what happened in 1969 that we just talked about? Stonewall Inn. And of course, all the other stuff in the 60s. Up until this time, again, everything had been moderate. So you see why, in the homosexual movement, you see why in 1968, they still publish something like what they do. But then 1969 happens, and something happened after 1969 in 1974. In 1974, the American Psychiatric Association publishes a revision of their book. In order to do that, you have to have meetings beforehand so you're ready. In 1970, 1971, they held meetings. Where were the meetings held? Does anybody know? In San Francisco. The homosexual activists after 1969 went out there, some of the most volatile ones, and they went to the place where this conference was being held. And they threatened the people of the APA, would not even allow them to get from their hotel rooms to their convention floor. Disrupted it, threatened their lives, and basically, I've got some things in my notes here, said, well, I guess it doesn't get much worse than threatening their lives. What are you going to do if you're on the APA board, or if you're one of their members? Yeah, you're going to take that pretty seriously. And they did. So seriously that they joined forces. And they even, I've got some videos showing, if we end up getting to that point, we're able to show them with the internet here, they end up colluding together with the homosexual crowd and publishing something together, so that in 1974 they removed homosexuality from the book, and they used instead the phrase sexual orientation disturbance. Sexual orientation disturbance. Basically what they're saying is homosexuality now there's nothing wrong with. Instead, it's a behavioral problem. Which, remember, this is a book for mental disorders. So we're calling it a behavioral problem, which doesn't fall under mental disorder. So basically, the APA doesn't have anything to do with this anymore. Number 4, the fourth revision came out in 1980, the DSM-3. They removed sexual orientation disturbance category and replaced it with ego-dystonic homosexuality. That means self-orientation on there, sexual orientation versus self-image. If your sexual orientation is homosexuality, that's fine. But if you think you should be something else, that's when you have a problem. I'm a male, I think I should be a female, or I think I should be attracted to males. That's when we have a problem. And I'm bothered by it. But if somebody outright just says, I'm attracted to males and I'm not bothered by it, that's not a problem. That's what they're going after here. And then 1987, completely removed sexual orientation disturbance. So by 1987, there's no reference to anything. You see how fast that changed? 1974 to 1987, 13 years. Who have they infiltrated so far now? Church. And they're growing, and they're still growing. That message is out there in just about every church body today. They're constantly going after the government. And the last area that they needed to go after and they wanted to go after is science and medicine. And they've been accepted from the get-go. They've knocked down every barrier without really proving anything. We're going to go into some of the stuff that's coming up. Here are some of the actual articles that the APA was considering at that time. And they proposed this. This is from December 1973. This is an internal statement that's been retired. If homosexuality per se does not meet the criteria for a psychiatric disorder, what is it? Well, descriptively, it's one form of sexual behavior. Our profession need not now agree on its origin, significance, and value for human happiness when we acknowledge that by itself it does not meet the requirements for a psychiatric disorder. Similarly, by no longer listing it as a psychiatric disorder, we're not saying that it is normal or as valuable as heterosexuality. But they're simply saying we're removing it. Then, one more. Having suggested that homosexuality per se is not a psychiatric disorder, what about those homosexuals who are troubled by or dissatisfied with their homosexual feelings or behavior? See, that's the only class they're going after. If somebody wants to be a homosexual and they have no conscience or no problem with it, that's great. They're not bothered by that. Now the APA will only deal with homosexuals who have a conscience, who are guilty, feeling guilty or bothered by this, which we know how the conscience works. It's going to bother a number of them, at least at first. These individuals have a psychiatric condition by the criterion of their subjective distress, whether or not they seek professional help. It is proposed that this condition be given a new diagnostic category defined as follows: sexual orientation disturbance. And let's look at some data. In the 90s, homosexuality was at the forefront again. I remember Magic Johnson came out with HIV, and all of a sudden it really hit the mainstream. I mean, a fantastic NBA player to have such a big thing happen. And because of that, and other events too, all of what's been building up, now you start to have studies and people are trying to prove there's a gay gene. Is that the case? Look at the studies behind me. Twin studies done in 1991 by Bailey and Pollard, a genetic study of male sexual orientation. They gathered samples, though, only through gay publications. They tried to replicate the previous findings and could not. What does this mean? Bailey concluded this suggests that concordances from prior studies were inflated due to concordance-dependent ascertainment bias. Boy, that sounds like a mouthful, doesn't it? Basically, he's saying our findings weren't legitimate. We had bias. This is the own author writing about this. Did the news media ever report that? If we go back, he did twin studies. He gathered biased samples, publicized something, and said, yes, there's a gay gene, essentially. But his own research, the media picked it up and said there's a gay gene. He himself, though, said, the new study did not provide statistically significant support for the importance of genetic factors in causing homosexual orientation. We didn't find it. But that was never reported. Another one. Recent twin studies. In a nutshell, if you take pairs of identical twins in which one twin is homosexual, the identical co-twin is usually